Think about this for a second. How much pressure would it take for you to deny Jesus? Would someone have to threaten your life? Would they have to put a gun to your head, threaten your family? Or would it only take an uncomfortable question? A few hours earlier, you remember, Peter had pulled his sword out. He had chopped off the ear of Malchus. And then an armed group came to arrest Jesus. And like I said, Peter pulled out a sword and he was ready to fight. But before the night is over, the man who was willing to swing a sword in front of armed soldiers will not have enough courage to tell a mere servant girl that he follows Jesus. He could face swords, but he could not face a question. What happened? Really, Peter had told Jesus, I will lay down my very life for you. And he meant it. But there is a difference between taking courage and discovering what happens when that courage comes under fire. John places two men under pressure side by side. Jesus will be questioned on the inside. Peter will be questioned on the outside. Jesus will face powerful religious authorities. Peter will face servants standing around a fire. One will stand firm, the other will begin to crumble. And that leaves us with a question that we need to wrestle with today. Where does that courage to remain faithful actually come from? Jesus has now been arrested and led away in chains. He appears to be the powerless one. But Jesus, now take special note of this, Jesus is exactly where he needs to be. This is the plan. This is the Father's will. Peter, meanwhile, is about to discover how fragile his own courage really is. Let's start off by reading John 18:12 to 18. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since the disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. So John says, first they led him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Annas had once served as high priest. Even after Rome removed him, he remained very influential. His son-in-law Caiaphas now held the office of high priest. Then John reminds us of something that Caiaphas had said earlier. It would be better for one man to die for the people than the whole nation to perish. Caiaphas, he meant that politically. Get rid of Jesus, save the nation. But without realizing it, he spoke a far greater truth. One man was really going to die for the people, not merely to preserve a nation, but to save sinners. These leaders think they are controlling what happens to Jesus. But God is accomplishing his redemptive purpose even through evil choices. That does not mean evil is good. It means evil cannot overthrow God's eternal purposes. So when life looks completely out of control, sometimes I wonder, where is God in this? Remember the scene. Jesus is bound before corrupt authorities, but God has not lost control. Human opposition can never derail God's redemptive purposes. And now, John turns our attention to someone following behind. John writes, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Don't miss that. Peter followed Jesus. Peter loved Jesus. When others scattered, Peter stuck around. Peter followed. The problem was not that Peter lacked devotion. The problem was that Peter trusted too much in Peter. Earlier, he had told Jesus, I will lay down my life for you. And I believe he honestly meant it. He even pulled a sword in the garden. Peter was ready for something dramatic. What he was not prepared for was an ordinary question in the courtyard. And sometimes ordinary faithfulness is harder than dramatic courage. Peter is about to learn a painful lesson. Good intentions are not the same thing as spiritual strength. That is why we should be very careful when we say, I would never do that. Peter had walked with Jesus for 3 years. He had seen the miracles. He even walked on water. He had confessed Jesus as Christ. And yet, Peter was still capable of failing. Our confidence cannot ultimately rest in ourselves. It must rest in Christ. The other disciple gets Peter into the courtyard, and now Peter stands at the door. The test has arrived. The servant girl, this is a girl, mind you, says, you are not one of this man's disciples, are you? Think about that. Peter's not before Annas. He's not before Caiaphas. He's not even before a Roman soldier threatening Peter's life. A servant girl. And Peter answers, I am not. Only a few verses earlier, soldiers, they came looking for Jesus, stepped forward and said, I am. Now Peter is asked whether he belongs to Jesus, and Peter says, I am not. Jesus steps forward, and Peter steps way back. Jesus identifies himself. Peter hides his identity. And that, my friends, is where courage under fire begins to crack. Not with some dramatic rejection of Christ. Just 3 words. I am not. That is often how compromise begins. Not in I reject Jesus, but maybe I just won't say anything. Maybe I'll just kind of blend in. Maybe I'll keep my faith to myself. And before we become too hard on Peter, perhaps we should ask, how many times have we warmed ourselves at the saint of the fire? Maybe nobody asked you directly whether you follow Jesus. But maybe you had the opportunity to make it picture clear. And you stayed quiet because you feared what it might cost. John tells us Peter stood warming himself with the servants and officers. Peter is physically close to Jesus, but he is beginning to distance himself spiritually. That is a danger. You do not have to walk completely away from Jesus to begin compromising your allegiance to him. Peter wanted to stay close enough to see what happened, but not so close that following Jesus cost him something. And now John takes us inside, where Jesus is facing a far greater pressure and showing us what courage under fire looks like. Let us read John 18:19-24. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "Have I spoke openly to the world? Have I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together? I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is this how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now John takes us back inside. While Peter is outside by the fire, Jesus stands before Annas. Verse 19 says, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Annas wants to know who is following Jesus and what he's been teaching. But Jesus answered only concerning his teaching. Have I spoken openly to the world? Have I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together? I have said nothing in secret. In other words, there is no secret conspiracy. Jesus taught openly, publicly, and repeatedly. Then he says, "Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me and what I said to them. They know what I said." Jesus is exposing the weakness of the proceeding. If Annas wants to establish charge, bring the witnesses. Jesus has nothing to hide. And there, my friends, is courage under fire. Jesus does not change his message because the room has become hostile. He simply stands in the truth. But then the pressure becomes physical. When he had heard these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is this how you answer the high priest?" Jesus is bound. He has not been convicted of anything, and now he has been struck for speaking the truth. Listen to what he says. If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? But here's the thing I want you to really think about. You and I would probably retaliate. Jesus does not retaliate. But neither does he pretend the injustice is acceptable. If I am wrong, prove it. If I have spoken truthfully, why are you striking me? There is something very important there for us. Following Christ, now listen very carefully, following Christ does not mean calling evil good or remaining silent about wrongdoing. But neither are we free to answer sin with sin. Early on, you have heard me talk openly about abortion and how that is murder and how that is wrong. But you also will not find me burning down an abortion clinic, because that, my friends, would be answering sin with sin. And so Jesus speaks the truth without revenge. Then John simply says, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Annas gets absolutely nothing from Jesus. No confession, no secret conspiracy, and Jesus is sent on. He is still bound, he is still accused, he is still moving to the cross. And that is where we need to see something deeper. Jesus is not merely giving us an example of courage. Oh no. Jesus is going to the cross. He is faithfully carrying out the mission the Father gave him. And remember what he said in the garden. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? At this point, Jesus has accepted the wrath, the cup. He's accepted the fact that he's going to the Father. So the interrogation does not turn him back. The slap does not turn him back. The injustice does not turn him back. Every step, he gets getting closer to the cross. And here's the heart of it. Peter is outside trying to save himself. Jesus is inside continuing towards the cross to save sinners. That, my friends, is courage under fire. Not confidence that nothing bad will happen. Not confidence that obedience will be easy, but confidence in the Father that keeps obeying even when obedience costs us. And now John takes us back outside. Peter's test is far from over. Jesus stands by the truth. Jesus suffers without sinful retaliation. Jesus keeps moving towards the cross in obedience to the Father. And I would definitely keep saying, shall I not drink the cup? Shall I not drink the cup? Let us go to John 18, 25 to 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, you also are not one of the disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. John now takes us back outside. Peter is still standing under the fire, warming himself. He has already denied Jesus once. And again they ask, you are not also one of the disciples, are you? Peter answers once again for the second time, I am not. The first denial may caught him off guard. This one does not. Peter has had time to think about it. When the question comes again, he repeats the denial. That, my friends, is one of the dangers of compromise. The first step makes the second step a whole lot easier. We tell ourselves, I'm just going to do this one time. Just one time. It is not that serious. But sin has a way of gaining momentum. You know what it is like, right? I'm just going to have one cookie before dinner. Before you eat, the cookie jar is empty. And now the third question comes. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, did I not see you in the garden with him? Think about this. The pressure has become greater. This man may have actually seen Peter in the garden. He is related to Malchus, the man Peter attacked with the sword. So Peter moves from embarrassment now to fear. If he is identified, there could be consequences. And then comes the question, didn't I see you with him? Peter again denied her. The man who once said, Jesus, I will lay down my life for you, has now denied him 3 times. And you hear, the rooster has crowed. Can you imagine that sound and how it cut to the heart of Peter? Jesus had told him this would happen, and now it had. Told him this would happen, and now it had. The rooster exposed something Peter desperately needed to hear. Peter was not as strong as Peter thought he was. Granted, he loved Jesus, but for love for Jesus and confidence in ourselves are not the same thing. Peter had trusted his courage, his determination, his ability to stand, and now all of it collapses like a house of cards. And that ought to make every one of us extremely careful when we say, I would never do that. And right? You can read the Old Testament. You can say, I would never, ever want to build a calf of gold because Moses is taking forever to come back. I'm the first person who might say that. Let's find all our jewelry and build this calf. Because Moses, he's been gone forever. I try to put myself in the shoes of those characters in the Old Testament because they're human just like us. And Peter would have said the same thing. I would never do that. The lesson is not that we should walk around wondering when we are going to fail, because we're going to fail. The lesson is that our confidence was never meant to rest in ourselves. Courage under fire does not come from believing that I am strong enough. It comes from depending on the one who is. Peter's night ended with the sound of the rooster. His self-confidence is shattered. But thankfully, Peter's story is not over. If you had, in Acts 4, for instance, we learn that Peter did come around. On September 11th in 2001, when the World Trade Centers were burning, thousands of people were trying desperately to get out. They were moving down the stairwells, down towards the exits, away from the fire, away from the danger. And some people were even jumping out of windows because they didn't want to get burned by the fire. It was just horrendous. Thing was, everybody was trying to move away from death. But there was another group of people that were moving towards the danger. And that was our brave firefighters and first responders. Quite honestly, I pray for those guys every day. While everyone else was coming down, they were going up. Think about that picture. Everything in our human instinct says, get out, save yourself. But those firefighters were moving towards the danger because there were people above them who need to be rescued. And that picture takes me to John 18. Peter is standing outside trying to save them. Someone asks, are you one of his disciples? And Peter says, I am not. Peter is trying to get away from the danger. Peter is moving in the opposite direction. But Jesus, he knows where this road leads. He knows there will be another interrogation. He knows there will be another trial. He knows there will be more mocking. He knows there will be more beating. The whip they used to whip Jesus with, it wasn't just some regular whip. It had little bone fragments in the whip. If you were to be whipped like Jesus, I personally don't know how he would survive the whipping. Jesus knows there will be a crown of thorns. And he keeps going. And here's a big clincher. Not because he cannot escape. We're talking about the Son of God. He could have called down a legion of angels and wiped the whole thing out. He did not. We know he could have escaped. But he keeps going because sinners need to be rescued. Peter is not trying to save himself. Peter was trying to save himself denying Jesus. Jesus moving towards the cross to save Peter. And not only Peter, but you and me, all of humanity. That is the gospel. In Hebrews 9:22, it says, without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins. We had to have a perfect, spotless lamb. We had to. And in the garden, we had the first Adam. The first Adam failed terribly. Jesus is described as the second Adam, the Son of God, who's absolutely perfect, never sinned once, never, and went to the cross, shed his blood once and for all. I am extremely grateful for that. I cannot imagine what it was like to live in the Old Testament. That would have been extremely hard, having to shed all of those animals all of the time. So when Peter's courage failed, Jesus remained faithful. When Peter backed away, Jesus kept going toward the cross. When Peter was trying to save his life, Jesus was preparing to give his life. So maybe the question at the end of the sermon is not, am I strong enough to stand? Peter thought he was. A better question is, am I trusting the one who is faithful enough to save me and strong enough to sustain me? Because courage under fire does not ultimately come from believing in ourselves. It comes from trusting Jesus Christ. Our courage may fail. Our strength may fail. We may fail. But Jesus never fails and always remains faithful. Let us pray.